Okay, we're back. A couple of things. I have, for your studying pleasure, and if you're taking the lecture, you can look at this too. Many years ago, when I used this textbook in earlier editions, I outlined some of the chapters. So, tissues and skin are outlined for you here. You see, all of this is on this cooking here on the week one part. So it's useful for lecture and for lab. I don't know. However you wish to use it, feel free. Uh, Offering it to you at no extra charge. Shouldn't say that. I think it. So this is what we're doing next is tissues. And so this is the tissue portion of it that you can see here. So you end up with, so it has this and basically gives you really just effectively an outline of the chapter, but it's relatively quick reading for what you're going to be looking at. And we'll cover a lot of the questions on the quizzes, particularly that I will send you. Okay? So that should cover that fairly efficiently. Which brings us to the next one. So we're doing 4A and I'll get 4B up there in a sec. B. Okie dokie. 4A. They haven't changed the format of this book in 20 years. They do update some of the information. That's here. Vis-a-vis the, you don't need to buy the book. For me, I mean, if you're doing like you're doing the lecture, if you need it, if he uses the mastering, which he might, I don't know. If you need some assistance from me in that, something that I have here, and you're using the book, let me know. To me, I've got all the information here for the lab, so I just think it's an extra expense. If you're not required to get the book, and there's a ton of books older. Rule number one for college students: don't buy the book the first day. It's unbelievable. People do that because a lot of times it drives me nuts. And it's gotten a little more affordable with ebooks. I came from an age where there were all these massive things that you couldn't lift. Nevertheless, here we go. Tissues. I've skipped the cell part for now. Effectively, what happens is when we look at the cell a little more intensely, there's lots and lots of different cells. Tissues are made up mostly of relatively simple cells. Okay? Until we get into the really higher functioning tissues. It's a relatively simple cell that's very, very busy in the liver, for instance. But lining tissues, relatively simple cells. Connective tissues, relatively simple cells, very, very versatile cells. When we get into more advanced kinds of structures, muscles and nerves, they're really in a different category in themselves, and I don't really incorporate that here so much. So they're all very, very interesting. And the ones we look at first, so we deal with muscles and nerves separately. Okay. And when I'm looking at muscle and nerve tissue, it's not something we do in the lecture. We just get the large structure once they're formed from a laboratory perspective. Epithelial and connective tissues are a really important part of all this because they make up all the structures. So in short, epithelial tissues, okay, yes, they're boundaries between different environments, and they have a lot of functions: protecting, secreting, absorbing. They line things inside and out. Anywhere there's an exposure, whether to the outside, whether it's your skin, your mouth, or your nose, where it's a moist boundary, or it's lining your gut. These are all different kinds of epithelial tissues, even some on the inside. Those serosa, those serous cells, like in the lung and in the heart, they are lining tissues. And basically, they have a certain degree of function that we can analyze and understand from their, again, this is the relationship between structure and function. Connective tissues bind things together. It's what their name tells you what they do, they connect. And you can see they have different components. So we'll start. Microscopically, first thing to understand, it depends on how they're sliced. So we use the term slices a lot. And it depends on how they're stained. And the trouble with some of these things, and I'll tell you about it, is that when they stain the slides, we get what are called artifacts. Things that are there that shouldn't be there. For instance, sometimes I used to do my own x-rays and we didn't have digital technology. We dipped them in the old liquids that were in non-digital technology, like developing film. And every so often you get a mark on an x-ray. I wonder if that's a fracture. Well, if it wasn't, if it was just because there was a problem with the process of developing it, it's called an artifact. So what we see sometimes, and you'll see them here when we get into skin particularly, what are called artifacts, things that are there that really are not there. They're there because it's something in the processing. You see, we actually see a layer of skin that was defined that really is more about the fact that it doesn't stain than anything else. So sometimes it's just playing tricks with you. And you're going to see we use colors to be able to distinguish it in the dyes, and electron microscopes use specialized technology where they embed different types of basically heavy metals inside the developing apparatus to give you the pictures that you see. So voila, this is what you're looking at, different kinds of electron microscopes. So when we look at these, I'll comment on them. Scanning takes a three-dimensional view. Typical electron microscopes give you a two-dimensional view, but you get a lot more detail. These give you an idea that you can see. Those are the things that line your throat. They're called cilia. And they play a very important role in moving things around and protection. So we'll start here. Epithelial are lining tissues. They are effectively, and they're beautifully described in the first sentence, sheets of cells. Tabletop. You go out and you made something at home and you put a piece of plastic wrap on top of it. It's an epithelial tissue. Okay, put foil on. It's a little different kind of epithelial tissue. It's a liner for lap and everything, and in sheet, and all the cells are interconnected. They are the cells in our bodies that reproduce the most rapidly. That's the good news. They're easily replaceable. If you scrape your skin made of epithelial tissues and it's not very deep, it's going to come back. You'll never know you had an injury. That's the good news. There's bad news. Those are the cells that produce nearly all of our important cancers. See, that's a two-edged sword of reproduction. Reproduction, cells that don't reproduce, cells that reproduce get cancer. When epithelial cells reproduce, they get a specific last name called carcinomas. When connective tissue, which is the next part of this discussion, they also reproduce, some not as fast as, not nearly as fast as epithelial cells, they get a different kind of cancer with a different name called sarcomas. So, the most common prostate cancer and breast cancer are surely the most common cancers, respectively, in women and in men. Both have the same last name, adenocarcinoma. Adeno means gland. They're glandular cancers. And one thing about them is very true. We don't want them. Not that you necessarily can avoid them, but you can try. So internal and external, they line. They are a boundary. They also, glands, basically their lining has various types. And so glands are little opening that either go into the skin or into your mouth or into your nose. But also you have glands in your stomach, for instance, that make materials that help enhance digestion and absorption. So in general, if they're thick, the thicker they are, they protect. They absorb, and that's like classically in the digestive area. In the kidney, they filter. And the way they filter is they're not exactly closely packed together. They have little openings in them. And they act like a filter. If you're making drip coffee in the morning, you're using a coffee filter. So the liquid gets through and the grounds hopefully don't. They play a role in excretion because we get rid of stuff by that way. They also make things that we get rid of. That's secretion. And yes, they sit on top of little nerves for sensory reception. They're unique because they have what's called polarity. This has nothing to do with positive and negative charge. It's position. I'll show it to you. They hold next to each other. They always have connective tissue underneath them. Understand now that under every lining cell, you have at least even a tiny layer of what's called loose, and the fancy term is areolar because it's got air in it, a little bit, or areolar or areolar connective tissue. Interestingly, as fast as it replicates, it doesn't have a direct blood supply. It gets all its blood supply from that underlying tissue. So that in itself is interesting, and yes, it regenerates very well. So they got a top and a bottom. This is sort of a geographical polarity. So what you're going to see is these cells typically attach to some type of a base layer, usually made out of protein, maybe some other fatty material, and they look a little bit like this, like a bunch of teeth. They're next to each other and all attached to each other and attached to what's holding them. What's holding them is called the basilar membrane, or basal lamina, depending on the Latin. So this is the basal or base side, and this, the top, sticking out, is called the apex, or it's the apical side. So you have a basal aspect and an apical aspect. And those are terms that you see repetitively. It doesn't have to be out here. That apical aspect could be inside. Your blood vessels are hollow tubes. Okay? Sticking out into the hollow tube are those kind of cells. They're very, very smooth. They're very, very skinny. And there's not a whole lot protruding, not a lot on them. And they're designed for one thing, to do this. I do it all the time. It's like a coat on a tabletop. So your blood would flow right over it like that. What you don't want it to do is contact something, because when blood cells come together, they clot. We don't want them to clot. So you have the apical surface, typically smooth. Some you will see have little projections. Those have additional function. Microvilli, tiny fingers, are there for absorption in your digestive area. When I showed you that micrograph before, the cilia, those help to move mucus. We see those in the gut sometimes, but mostly in the respiratory area. And just think what happens when you get a cold and you start to bring all that stuff up. Well, it's trapping nasty stuff, and you're able to, and basically it's pushing it towards your mouth so you can some way, shape, or form expel it. So the base lamina is somewhat of a sheet that holds it on, and that's how we define it. And there's all sorts of nuances. So this is classic. These are, fancy name for these, this is the connective tissue underneath it. These are all the nuclei of the cell. What you're seeing there is the apical surface. And if they have better fixed, it would look like tiny little fingers. It's called microvilli. It acts like a brush border. This would be in your gut. This would be a classic area that you would see in your stomach or in your small intestine. All the time. There, I drew little lines. They are contacts. And the contacts hold them together. The two major contacts are tight junctions. And tight is code for watertight. It's like if you're handing in a report and you put a staple in it, okay, it's holding it together. But if you took it along one side and put a whole series of staples, stuff couldn't get in between the pages too easily. That's kind of it's as though they're cinched together all along the perimeter. The more tight junctions, the less likely water can or other fluids can get in between them. That's really important. So for people who drink, I personally don't, or do so extraordinarily frequently, what it does to their stomach is it damages their lining. And what happens is the acidity in their stomach can get in and then damage it in the inside, and maybe they'll get problems associated with it. And it's not just alcohol, painting that as being a picture, but that's one of the things alcohol does, for instance. Now, what are very, very strong, and certain of these lining cells have to be held together because they're moving around a lot. They're called desmosomes. It's like little rivets. It's as though you were at home and you had a screw and a washer and a nut, and you were putting that in. And sometimes I'm not very good. That's why I'm there. That holds it together. So within the connective tissue, they have the base layer, and then you have another layer underneath it. All the time, one thing that we see almost exclusively in all connective tissues is the most abundant protein we have in our body. We've got more of this than anything else. Bones are made out of it. Tendons and ligaments are made out of it. It's called collagen. Collagen gets a lot of ink these days because we use more uses for it. It's a protein we can acquire. A lot of protein people take this as a supplement. They'll buy it in protein powders and put it in milk or different drinks and things like that. Very strong because there's so much movement. Think of your skin moving back and forth like that. It's not tearing every time we do this. There's inherently a certain amount of elasticity, and that's interestingly when we get to that in skin. I know a whole lot about skin because I used to treat a lot of skin problems. So here, what happens is cancers don't be contained. They're invasive by nature. That boundary is insufficient to hold them. And that's a big problem as they spread. Does not have any blood supply. Nerves, yes. The blood, because that boundary is not terribly strong and not terribly thick, it's easy for oxygen and carbon dioxide, nutrients and waste products to trade places. So it's good news, bad news. You have lots of ability for energy transformations. You have lots of ability to grow more of them and replace them. The trouble is it's not very protective when something bad is trying to get in. So they regenerate quickly. And it's all about, it's like when you scrape your skin for whatever reason. Friction. A cut, something at home, my dog, okay, who explores the world through his mouth. Basically what happens is as soon as some of those lining cells are lost, there's something called contact inhibition. Contact inhibition is a neat thing in normal cells. When they're all grouped together and they don't have any room, they stop growing. As soon as there's some room, that signal is lost and it stimulates growth. So when anything on us is damaged, we start to heal right away. We have all different types of chemicals that are released, and they're clustered under a group name. They have more specific names called growth factors. We didn't even know about those. I got my doctorate in 1977, and we started hearing in medical conferences and surgical conferences about growth factor about 10 years after that. That's when molecular biology hit. So we knew things healed, but the specifics weren't that terribly available. I remember sitting at Hershey Medical School. We were at a conference, and the guy's up there, and I'm sitting there like, when he's talking about how nerves can heal and you don't have to sew them together, just as long as they're closely to it, that's something called nerve growth factor. It's like, you're like, oh my goodness. We'd seen examples of it that would be to understand. So the first name tells you how many layers. Simple is code for single, one layer. Stratified, strata means layers, multiple layers, means more than one. It could be 2, it could be 62. Doesn't matter, more than one. When you have multiple layers, more protective, maybe more functionality. The second name has to do with the shape. And by convention, meaning everybody's agreed, that it's the shape of the outer, if there's multiple layers, the layer that's mostly on the outside. That is the clue. Because the base layers, when you have multiple layers, often look the same. They become more distinguishable as you get farther away. Why? Because they're getting farther away from their blood supply, and their shape becomes somewhat distinctive. So the second name is their shape. Squamous. Technically, it means shingle, like on a roof. But really, what we see is it's like a fried egg. Like you made an egg, and you had the yolk in the center. That's the nucleus, and it's spread out wide in your frying pan. Okay, so it's like an egg over easy, and the nucleus is relatively small, but it has this wide. So you have a little dot in the middle, and you have this whole top. A lot of surface area. Things can move in and out easily. Where do we see a lot of those? In our lungs. Oxygen and carbon dioxide constantly moving in and out. Vast amounts. Why? A lot of surface area. If they have more function, if they make things or absorb things, or secrete, means protrude or get rid of things, they're a little bit boxier, cuboidal. And it also has to do with the shape of the nucleus. It's the shape of the cell, the layers of the cell, and also we get a clue from the shape of the nucleus, as you will see. And if they're taller steel, like the ones I showed you before, okay, called columnar, the nucleus is a little more elliptical, a little more elongated, more function yet. So when it's multiple layers, shapes vary as they typically get farther away from their blood supply. So this is simple, called simple squamous, tons everywhere. Lines every blood vessel, lines every lung, every area within your lung. Just for instance, all those pleura and pericardia and peritoneal linings, simple squamous. Well, and it's really not drawn to scale here. The nucleus is tiny compared to the overall surface area. This is stratified. So stratified typically starts more cuboidal or columnar and flattens out as it goes away from its blood supply. So squamous, cuboidal, columnar. Look at the nuclei. Flattened, round, elongated. That are there. So they have a lot of, is there absorption and secretion? Sure, but not a lot. And it's generally not really highly manufactured products. It's maybe droplets of perspiration. Some of that lubricating moist lining would have interprotein that are in it. So they flatten out. They don't have a lot of cytoplasm. It's basically membrane. And the beauty of that, oxygen and carbon dioxide, for instance, get to remember, your skin's like that. A lot of people don't know it. A lot of medicines easier to get through the skin. You put a patch on. Like people who use patches to stop smoking. They didn't work for me. I smoked more. I haven't smoked in 15 years. But if I smoked 40 years, 2 packs a day. Which is why I'm alive, is beyond this. So, for instance, those patches work because certain substances we call fat soluble, pain medicine or like that, pain medicine patches go through there a lot. I mean, it's a very, very useful method there. Where it's all about diffusion, moving quickly across the membrane. Kidneys have a lot, lungs have a lot. So the lining of blood vessels in the heart, and then those interior structures, the lung, the pericardia, the pleura. And so this is lung. Lung has a lot of air, and you can see the exchange. There's tiny blood vessels in here. So it's basically just a lot of membrane. And so it allows a tremendous amount of movement. So it's a combination. What makes the lungs work is having a lot of space for air and having a lot of lining cells. What happens when people smoke long term, and I was like this, is you get a lot of damage to the air, and the air these break down and get very thick. What happens? The air gets trapped. We have a special name for trapped air: emphysema. Emphysema doesn't have to be in your lung. It means air is trapped. Cuboidal, we see a lot in like sweat glands. We also see that in the kidney because the kidney does a ton of secretion and absorption. Like basically the kidney filters all the fluid in your blood and basically takes it out and sucks 99% back up, other than the stuff it wants to get rid of that we call urine. So, I mean, the kidney filters through about, it's a startlingly large number, about 40 to 45 gallons of water in your blood with all the chemicals in it, and basically reabsorbs 99% of it. So it's shocking. 160 to 180 liters a day for you and I. And so that's what a kidney tubule looks like. It's got a hollow area. Fancy name is called the lumen. That's the name for hollow tubules. You can see the rounded. So we know they're cuboidal. And it's just clusters of these throughout the kidney, constantly processing. They kind of look shaped like that. Column, longer. So closely packed, and a lot of them have what you're going to see. And they have better illustrations than I can do. The tip of the cell it's not flat, it's got like little ups and downs, like that. So it's almost like you had a mattress that you put on a foam mattress. In the old days, we had an egg crate. It's like those things have like magic fingers. You almost like add a layer of cushioning. They're not about cushioning, they're about surface area. Body has one of the great things the human body has. It creates all the surface area possible. We don't have a lot of room. So your digestive tract. Okay. Think of the area of your small intestine and large intestine. That's a tube about 20, 25 feet long. It's about a couple of inches. Take a garden hose, split it, and lay it flat. You can make like a strip on the floor, about 25 feet. In reality, all the little things like that, all these little protuberances effectively create surface area about the size of a tennis court. That's so you and I can absorb things easily in our diet. So, and a lot of times they have mucus to lubricate, and those are called goblet cells. So you'll see that in a second. Some of them have cilia to move the mucus around. So digestive tract, lungs, uterine tubes. It helps to move the egg along during fertilization. So take a look at this. This is typical gut. There's the brush border. That is a goblet cell with mucus, and you can see that. So it's called simple columnar. One layer, but a lot of surface area. In the lung, they have a variation of that, which is different. It's called pseudostratified, which means it's false layers. One layer. Every cell goes to the basement membrane. The nuclei, they don't all go to the top. One layer, but you'll see some of the cells are maybe half as high. So it looks like multiple layers. And they have a lot of cilia that you saw before because mucus is produced a lot and it's protective. It helps to move all the things we inhale or sometimes even bring into our mouth that are bacteria, viruses, particles, and get rid of them. So upper respiratory, some other glands, even testicularly, so they look like this. The microvilli are much shorter. Cilia are much longer. And what's interesting about both of those structures, it's kind of unique in the body. These are not like hairs sticking out of your heads, not mine. I know. Hair challenge. It's a long time. My dad wore a toupee for most of his adult life. I'm not so vain. He wasn't that vain. So it's kind of like, it's not like it's sticking out, a cilia. It's got membrane around it. It's actually inside the cell, and it's covered in membrane, so it sticks out like that. So it kind of protrudes. And so Those are now the layered epithelial cells. What happens is when they build from the bottom. It's not as though you have a layer of cells and a new cell layer on top and another layer on top and another layer on top. It's though you're building a wall. You put the first layer down and the next layer goes underneath it. It would be very difficult to build a wall. It's being built from the bottom up, and then the original layer is being pushed farther and farther away. It's kind of like building a pyramid in reverse. I want to think of it that way. 2 or more layers, they regenerate again from below. So the cells at the bottom are the ones that are moving farther. It's not like you're building new on the top, but underneath. More layers, the more protective. The most widespread is called stratified squamous. Multiple layers, but only the outermost apical layers are squamous everywhere. The skin inside of your mouth, the distinction, and we do a whole unit on skin, is that you can feel the skin, it's a dry, the cells are dead. As soon as you get to your lips or into your gums, now it's living. Those are cells that have, by living, it means they're still reproducing, they still have a nucleus. That's why forensically you can get DNA from saliva. We do this in the lab in micro. Take a swab like a Q-tip like they do on TV, and you can swab in there in the mouth, and you can get a DNA sample from that easy, because you can see tons of cells that, as long as the cell's nucleus, you can get the DNA from, and just enhance what you have there and do an identification. So the free surface, outermost, squamous, everything else cuboidal or columnar. It's all about protection, so think of wear and tear. In the skin, because they move far enough away from their blood supply, they die, and the cells transform into a protein with a protein inside with a membrane on the outside. The protein is called keratin. In your mouth, in your nose, throat, non-keratinized. They're still moist. So they look like this. This would be in your mouth. Base layers, columnar, cuboidal, flatten as they get farther away. Nuclei all the way out. We do see some multiple layers in some of the glands in cuboidal and columnar, but very, very limited. So they're relatively rare. You can Google that online. And the most fascinating to me, unfortunately, is this one. Transitional. It's only in what's called your urinary tract. Your urinary tract consists of 3 structures. The ureters, which are just hollow tubes that take the urine made in the kidney, no processing, thank you, and take it down to a storage tank called the bladder. And then there's an exit point in the storage tank called the urethra. And then as the urethra gets closer to exiting out of your body, whether you're male or female, then the epithelium becomes stratified squamous. So the transitional are here. They look, it's funny, think of when your bladder's full, you have multiple layers, like 7 to 12. When your bladder's full, the liquid squishes it. So it only looks like you have 2 or 3 layers. When your bladder is empty, after you go to the bathroom, it expands back out. And what's distinctive is they appear to change shape. Okay? So they can transition for storage. And what we see is it looks kind of similar at the base, but rather than being flat, like squamous cells, they're rounded here. And so if you have like 6 or 7 layers, maybe there's a lot, that would probably be relatively empty. If it looks like there's only 2 or 3, probably the bladder is full. And you can see it in the ureters and a little bit in the urethra. So they look kind of like that. Why is it so significant? That whole smoking thing. See, I didn't get lung cancer, I got bladder cancer, which I've been treated successfully for. The code for treated successfully means you can't never say it's cured, just say it's treated successfully. So it's here. So So just a little note. I didn't have to have anything major done, thankfully, but bad enough as it was. And then lastly, glands. Glands are interesting because they make up different kinds. They give off fluid and depends on how they're structured. So we're going to, in AP1, we talk about these kinds of glands. Exocrine glands. They have a duct, a passageway, like deep inside your skin out to the surface. Salivary gland in your mouth. Saliva. Okay. When we talk about endocrine glands, that's an AP2, pituitary gland, thyroid, pancreas, all about diabetes. That's a gland that's surrounded by blood vessels in one area, and the stuff just comes out. Those goblet cells that make the mucus are actually considered a unicellular, a gland that's made of one cell. It's a gland, even though it's a cell. Most of them are multicellular. They have different looks. So typically, like this would be a typical gland. It has an opening like a pore to the skin, kind of rounds in the bottom. It makes a secretion in here, and the secretion kind of goes out by way of this passageway called a duct. Ductless glands have blood vessels around them deep inside, so they don't go to the surface. It just kind of sucks up the fluid like a sponge. And so we'll talk about all of those down the road. Exocrine glands, inside, typically onto the skin or in the mouth, and sometimes into the body cavities. We have a lot more of those. Mucus, sweat, oil glands, which are at the base of your hair follicles, salivary glands in your mouth. And the difference is really kind of what they make. The more mucin is more proteinaceous, and it's stickier, it's thicker. Serous has just a trace amount of it. And so this is one of those goblet cells that they've stayed. It's a little factory in here that makes mucus, and it comes out. We see a lot of them in respiratory and a lot of digestive. Some people are born with a genetic defect where their mucus is too sticky. It's got a famous disease called cystic fibrosis. It's an inherited disease. I'm pretty sure it's sex-linked, meaning it comes from the mom's side, but mostly affects guys. And we've improved the life expectancy a lot. It's by no means great. That's there. And they're classified in a lot of different ways, and I'm not going to do it. Okay. And it's all of these things. So some are just a tube, and some are simple, and some are branched, and some are compound, and some are combinations. I don't go crazy with that. I do talk about these three. Typical sweat gland, you and I, if we're perspiring, is little droplets form in the base of a gland. Let's say it looks a little like this. Little droplets come out, and they go through there. Okay, that's called a merocrine. Another name you'll see is ECCRINE, called eccrine, sweat gland. So the perspiration is just secreted or given off by the cell. In a holocrine gland, the cell ruptures in little fragments. So because it's got membrane in it, it's very oily. And then there's a gland that's in between them called an apocrine gland, where just like the little tip breaks off. And that's kind of wet, but it has a little bit of oily. And some people don't think they exist. A lot of people, like myself, do think they exist. A lot of times they're the glands that we see form around secondary sex characteristics hairs. So under the arms and in the inguinal area, we think that has a lot, playing a role like things like body odor. And so that's noteworthy. Just a little bit more, and you can be on your merry way. Nobody wants me. Why? One of those my wife has in order. Since your mom is in a nursing home, you stop on your way home at mom's, check the birds, take in the mail, put the garbage thing in the porch. Will do. Gentlemen, I have regard for my health. Don't get hurt. Okay, last roundup. We'll try to get through it as expeditiously as possible. I get the wrong one. Connective tissues. Groups of cells. The lining tissues are all together. Connective tissues are different. They're connected. They're just not next to each other. This is a sheet. This is like the classroom. Cell here, cell here, cell here. And it's like you had a string from you to him, and a string from you to him, and a string from you to her. So the cells are not next to each other. So it has to have cells. It has to have the strings, we call those fibers. Okay? And it has to have some kind of material in between them that we refer to as a ground substance. And that substance, the combination of that substance, it can be liquid, it can be air, it can be thick and dense, it can be hard like bone. So it can go anywhere from liquid to solid or anywhere in between. And if you have those three things, cells, the ground substance, and the fibers, and the ground substance and the fibers together are called the matrix, then you have a connective tissue. That's the requirements. So it could be hard like bone or liquid like blood, and anything in between. Solid, loose, tight, dense, all about the arrangement. And so we'll look at these. Bone, we do a whole unit on, don't worry about it. Blood, you do a unit on in AP2. We'll save that. And we revisit these a number of times. Bind, support, protect, insulate. Energy, fat is where we store energy. And transport, that's the blood. So we'll look at the connective, and it's the way, this is exactly how it's organized. It's a great slide. You have three types of connective tissue that are considered loose. The difference between loose and dense is how tightly packed the fibers are. If the fibers are spread out, it's loose. This is loose under your skin. The underlayer of the epidermis of your skin is loose connective tissue. What makes it strong and tough is underneath that, it's called dense connective tissue. So you have two different types that are there. So in loose, we have ones that have a lot of air. We have ones that have a lot of fat cells, and it's really the airy one that have fat cells that have gone into it. And we have ones that are kind of like strainers that are in certain areas, particularly in your immune system. The dense ones are either very, very well organized, irregularly organized, or filled with elastic tissue. And cartilage and bone are a bit different that are there. It's interesting, all these cells come, most of you have heard about stem cells and growing organs. It's something that they've been trying to do for a long time, stem cell therapy. My granddaughter, who is going to be 6, unfortunately had a stroke when she was born. She's doing very, very well now. What they had done is they saved some of her cord blood and then utilized that as a technology to inject. The cord blood is rich in what are called mesenchymal cells. Those are cells that are very unspecific. They make all the different kinds of connective tissue in the hope that it will grow. It's very expensive that she had this done. And, when I see her next time over the summer, I'll may have a better idea. In general, she's been doing pretty good. But, a lot of damage on her right side. See, that does everything at her left. She's very difficult. So, going to school, relatively bright, a little behind the other kids, not a lot. I have pictures. A lot of pictures. And again, if you would look at her picture, you say, normal kid. So sometimes it's hard to tell. But nevertheless, those cells, a great many of those cells that make tendons and ligaments and cartilage start as something called a fibroblast. When you see the term blast, it means it's busy and active. When you see the term site, it means it's not really actively growing, but it's functioning. So there's lots of different cells. So fibroblasts with chemical signals or other signals that we don't understand why they change can become cartilage cells called chondroblasts. And down the road, they can even become bone cells called osteoblasts. They all start. Our bones come from stuff that was originally fibroblasts and then eventually became cartilage and eventually became bone. So the cells can kind of flip-flop to a certain extent. And so we're trying to take that ability to change and be able to actually grow organs and things like that. I mean, it's way stuff that it's more theoretical, I think. But that's why I think they were trying to help rebuild some of our nervous system. They have a gel, and the gel can be either very liquid or very solid. And most of the time they have one or more of these types of fibers. Collagen, most abundant. Reticulum, which is like a thin reticulum, which is a very, very thin collagen with a special coat. It acts like a filter, like a fine mesh filter. And then elastic, which is just that. It's like between the two of them in size. Collagen's thick as elastic as the skin is, and stretchy. So think where you can stretch. You have elastic fibers. So all of those things. And so we'll look through those briefly, and there's some of the things. So 3 characteristics, same origin, mesenchyme. That's why people save cord blood and things like that. Varying degrees of blood supply. Cartilage doesn't have one. Cartilage, when damaged, changes into bone because it's invaded. That's why we think bone becomes bone, by invading cartilage. Bone has a great blood supply. That's why I love bone. Bone heals well. They have a matrix. They have a fancy name called extracellular matrix. Protein, sugar, and a mesh. And there really is a physical component. Ground substance, that sort of substance varying from liquid to solid, fibers, and cells. Okay, and again, the first 2 make up the matrix. And it's just all variable. Unstructured gel, probably most common. Not so tightly packed that things can't get through it. We see it in fluids between cells, helps glue things together. This is a fancy name called proteoglycans, means sugar and proteins together. They play a really important role in joint and bone health. Chondroitin sulfate and hyaluronic acid are really an important part of cartilage and bone. And a lot of people, myself included, will take supplements that contain those, and anybody can take them to deal with arthritic problems. And what they are able to do is they trap water. If you ever had chemistry and you had one of those like test tube brushes, their shape anatomically, microscopically, looks like one of those brushes, like a bottle brush, like a baby bottle. And water gets attracted, holds on to it. So collagen, strongest, most abundant. Elastic, thinner, stretchy. Reticular, very, very skinny but coated. Blast cells, immature. Again, these are interchangeable almost. We don't do the blood unit here, but there's a variant of them. Site means it's really more functional than growing. You see all these in connective tissue under your skin, or in that loose connective tissue, you'll see white blood cells. They're part of your defenses. Mast cells, which are a white blood cell variant. Macrophages, which are your principal defenders. They gobble up damaged cells, bacteria, viruses. We don't repair ourselves so much as we replace ourselves. And we have things that cause damage, we devour it. Macrophage means big eater. if I am going to be reincarnated, I want to be reincarnated as a macrophage. Your whole day, you don't live very long, but all you do is eat. I don't think you get fat. See, you're skinny. A great picture. Okay, the fibroblast is got these long, like tentacle-like projections. They kind of disappear when it becomes less active. It makes all the fibers, the collagen, the elastin, the reticulin. There's a white blood cell. There's another white blood cell. Another white blood cell. Another white blood cell. Fatty cells. Nerves are in there. It's a great tissue. It's got everything in there. So these are the ones we look at. The loose, if it's not completely filled with stuff, it's got air. So the next time you sprain your ankle, twist your knee, what's it going to do? Swell up, right? The fluid, that's where it goes. It's right under it's right under the epidermis, the outermost layer of skin. That's where fluid accumulates. When we have swelling, it's in that area. And some people, unfortunately, when we get fat or overweight, where fat is stored, is the same kind of tissue, except it fills with fat. So, unfortunately, and it's very predictable where it goes in men or in women. I mean, there's different ways that it applies. So we have areolar, adipose, fatty tissue, which is important in some areas, around the heart, around the kidneys. We have a certain amount that you need for energy storage. And reticular, again, straining, we mostly see that in the spleen, where it strains sort of your blood to get rid of old red blood cells, and also defensively for invaders. And then we'll get to the dense one. So areolar, under every lining epithelial, there's loose areolar, universal packing material, ground substance, so water, as I was telling you about before, white blood cells. That's a micrograph, what it looks like. The thickness are the fibers. The thin ones are other fibers that are there, and occasionally you see different cellular forms. Adipose, nutrient storage, basically the same stuff fills with fat. Okay, a lot of blood supply. I don't want to get into white fat and brown fat, but this is what you see. Fatty cells have filled with fat, and the nucleus gets pushed to the side. When that happens in the liver, we see that fatty deterioration. Those cells begin to die, and the liver becomes inflamed, and eventually becomes non-functional. That's what happens to long-term alcoholism. That's what cirrhosis starts looking like that, and the liver gets worse. Reticular looks like areolar, but it's got a lot more of these reticular cells that mesh in certain areas. So, and all of the cells that are in there are basically white blood cells that are there. It's a little hard to tell. Dense, regular, two types. Tendons, ligaments. Same material. The difference between a tendon and a ligament, they're strong, they're ropes. And they're twirled. It's like you took a rope. It's like you took a strand of material. And another strand, 4 of them, you twirled them. It's like when you braid something. We should do it in surgery. We'd use monofilament steel wire. And we'd wire bones together, but I wouldn't use the strand as one filament. I would take one end of it, we'd fold it, and my assistant would hold one end, I'd hold the other end, and we twist it, make a braid out of it. This braid was stronger. The body does it. So we'll take a look. Dense, regular, very strong, closely packed, appears white, there's almost no blood supply in it. Slightly wavy, they're parallel, but it's not like parallel in geometry class with, you have transversal and parallel lines and all those angle things. Geometry, remember that? It's like they're held together, but they're wavy because of the arrangement, that sort of spiraling or twisting it does. Very little ground substance, very little blood supply. That's why when tendons and ligaments go, they don't repair very well. They only heal with scar tissue. So what do we do nowadays with an ACL tear? Very, very common. You graft, typically from the person or from a cadaver, something like that. You graft it. So you're basically putting in a replacement ligament or similar tissue. My younger son had that. He rode those BMX bikes. They do the flips. ACL when he's 17. I don't have children. And so they had to take a graft from his knee. They took some of his kneecap and some of his tibia and some of the ligament, basically inserted that in the knee joint. He had that done. And he's going to be 39 this month. So and ligaments just have a little more stretch. You have a little more elasticity. So there's no blood supply. That's why. Things to heal need blood supply. So it could be here. This is called the acromioclavicular joint where you separate your shoulder. This is the long tendon of the biceps. We'll look at that later. Irregular, like the deeper layer of your skin, called the deep dermis, very, very thick. It's a similar construction, but not as regular in arrangement. Sheets rather than bundles. Can pull and tug in different directions. So your joints, when you move, think of you're moving your shoulder this way and that way. It's got a lot of stretch in different directions. Thick enough to surround your kidney, your liver. So you can see it's very, very thick. You can't see a lot of blood supply, but not nearly as organized. They sort of go in every direction. And then elastic connective tissue, super stretchy. And the most interesting one of these, not so much in the vertebrae, to learn about is in your aorta. Your aorta and the biggest blood vessels you have are called elastic arteries. When the heart pumps, it's like a trampoline. It pushes them out this way. And when the heart relaxes, they rebound. Just like you jumped on a trampoline, you bounce back up. Well, that bounce back helps to push the blood much more efficiently and, interestingly, less turbulently. And it also plays a role in closing heart valves. So that's the lining of an aorta, and it's nearly completely filled with elastic tissue. Cartilage and bone, almost done. Okay, you're doing fine because my voice is going. Something signals those fibroblasts to change, and they start making cartilage. And what happens in cartilage, it's a thicker, we call it semi-solid. It's got more water, a little firmer, but it has some give to it that's there. So what happens is, and this is when we see the staining, it looks like there's a hollow area around the cell when it stops growing, when it becomes a chondrocyte. It's just an area that doesn't stain. But they gave it a name for this hollow area. They call it lacuna. It's like it has a little house. Bones do the same thing. So, I mean, a lot of this is something that's more artifactual. Collagen fibers, sugar proteins, tough and flexible, no blood supply. Blood hurts it. Again, doesn't repair. So the cartilage in your knee is a special type of cartilage. When you tear that, this happens in sport a lot, all you really can do, if it's minor, you could probably leave it alone. If it's fragmented, we go in, we don't sew it back together. We just grind down in an arthroscope a little bit of this stuff that's there, smooth it out, and suck out the fragments. You'll fill with a kind of scar cartilage. And you can do that a number of times. Eventually down the road is a problem. So the different cartilages, there are three. Hyaline on the ends of all your bones. Most common, all the respiratory cartilages, your Adam's apple, that type of stuff, your trachea. Elastic, two places, here in your ear. Your epiglottis that covers your windpipe and swallow. Fibrocartilage, that's strong. The knee cartilage, we call the menisci. The intervertebral discs, perfect examples. So there's what it looks like. We have that little, they thought that this was like a cavity. I just think it's an area that just doesn't stain. It has the same staining character. Most of us agree with that. And elastic just means it has elastic, you don't have to know it. And connective tissue, fibrocartilage has just a different appearance. So they're very, very similar. And the characteristic is you get a lot of uniform material in that hollow area. And it doesn't heal particularly well as you see sports injury. And a lot of times it becomes bone as we get older. We do a whole unit on bone. I'll just show it to you. That's what bone looks like. This is a blood vessel. Bone has, into contrast, and it forms in layers. This is called cortical bone, we'll learn about. So multiple layers of bone, they're called lamellar, which means layer bone. And these are the little lacunae. The bone cells are in there, and and it's almost as though little pieces of the cell, like arms and legs, stick out, and they're surrounded by this hard matrix, this hard substance. It gives it its strength, but blood vessels, and they can signal one another. And blood's just, the only thing here is that the fibers are dissolved. They're not solid. That's why blood is liquid. When do the fibers come out and become solid? When we hurt ourselves. They initiate the clotting cascade. We go from dissolved, called fibrinogen, then they become fibrin. The fibrin shows up, looks for all the world like a fishnet, traps red blood cells, and makes the blood clot. And I think that would be everything for today. So I will get all this to you. I will do a unit on the cell, and I will send that briefly. The cell will be maybe a half an hour, 40-minute presentation. So I can get that to you in my absence, and maybe talk a little bit about skin and things like that. And again, we're not going to be here next week, but week 3, and I'll email you. We'll be on site.